get recorded on YouTube, even if it's not getting recorded on Facebook. At least it's going to get recorded somewhere. So here we go, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and we are starting, inshallah. So inshallah, I'm just going to first, before I even start, we've got a couple Asmats here. I guess everybody's name is Asmat. So what I'll do is I'm going to put Maryam get recorded on YouTube, even if it's not getting recorded on Facebook. At least it's going to, there you go. That's me. Here we go. I'm going to make a couple co-hosts. So if you, and Aya, you're also a co-host. So if you may, you could just, I guess, admit people. So you're the boss. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, everyone, inshallah, we will continue. وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَإِلَى اللَّهِ تُرْجَعُ الْأُمُورِ. Of course, you want to put it within the previous context, in where previously we've got the ayat that were speaking about يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهُ وَتَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهُ, and it was talking about how within the ummah there's supposed to be a group doing ordering for what is good, forbidding what is bad. And we also talked about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the ummah to unite together and not go into disagreements or go into these divisions. And from here, basically continuing on the same pace. Okay, that way Zamzam won't say, oh, I'm confused, where are we at? How did we get into this? So that's why it's important to look at that pace. And where, yes, after speaking about the disputes that a lot of, whether Ahlul Kitab or even those that might disagree with the Muslims, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was laying out the different arguments, laying out what how to connect with the ummah and how to connect even with the argument there. Then of course continues a very important thing to bring about the unity with the ummah. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and unite together and do not go into these disputes that eventually will lead into a division within the ummah. And we talked in detail about that part. And of course, then it basically gives you the foundation in where do not go into this argument or these separations and divisions which are similar to the people of Ahlul Kitab, and without you recognizing, losing. Okay. Don't like that. And in order, okay, so to assume that my HDMI is silly, because it did this to me before. So my HDMI, this one is going away and this one is staying. Okay. All right. So after continuing with that, in order to get to the mission, remember, so yes, you do have a tool, which is the ummah being in unity, but the main mission is really to get to the akhirah. The main mission is to get to the akhirah, in where they're uniting in order to get to يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهُ وَتَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهُ, on the day where the faces would basically turn white and other faces would turn black. And in that situation, speaking about how we should connect with those that will have their appearance on Judgment Day, their appearance basically as congruent with their heart, congruent with their mind. And we talked about that in detail. تلك آيات الله نتلوها عليك بالحق وما الله يريد ظلما للعالمين, in order to lay out the foundation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically laying out the principles and the paradigms and the standards that he will be ruling people based off of, which is the risala, on which is basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent onto people, the message. And in that situation, in order to recognize Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and why do we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the principle and for the definition of haqq and batil? Well, simply because وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Simply because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that owns and is the complete and is the complete, the one that has all the dominance. And it's really important to relate when we speak about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're actually talking about a number of different names. Number one, the first one, when we're speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're talking about the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number two, you're speaking about the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has. You're speaking about the dominance. You're speaking about the authority. You're speaking about the incompensation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses in everything. And this is extremely important to lay it out in these areas, because that, and I always say, when you want to look into the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you always have to use two ayat, two very important ayat. Number one is basically ayat al-kursi, and the other ayah is basically the ayah in Surah Ash-Shura. Maybe we can even go to it right now so you could see it in Surah Ash-Shura. So let's go just remember 73. Let's go to ayah in Surah Ash-Shura so we could actually see what we're talking about and why it's important to actually see that ayah when we're speaking about understanding the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm just going to run to Surah Ash-Shura right there in order for you to see the ayat that whenever you want to study the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, you need to definitely go and look into Ayat al-Kursi, and we're going to get to Ayat al-Kursi in just a bit. The other part is that you're going to get to Surah Ash-Shura, and specifically this ayah right here, فَاطِرُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, as the Lord Almighty is the one that had ripped and basically created the earth, the heavens and the earth, the skies and the earth, in other words, all the galaxies that you see, and he created from your own selves azwaja. Azwaja is basically the duality, is basically the binary. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, he created from your own selves the binary system, and even from al-an'am, and even from the animals themselves, the different animals and the different things in nature, you will also see that the law of duality, or the laws of the laws of binary, making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. In other words, the different laws that you would have on earth in nature, whether we're talking about the duality of male-female, the binary male-female, or whether you're talking about space, occupying space, whether you're talking about weight, whether you're talking about the beginning, end, losing energy, life, etc. All of these things are not applied whatsoever on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. In other words, the different laws that you apply and that you see in nature, you do not apply it on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's nothing like unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the animal nature, in the human nature, in biology, we always say, well, in order to make a reproduction, or in order to have children, whatever it is, in other words, continue in existence of that particular thing, you're always looking at the system of binary, the system of male and female. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, I want you to do what is called al-qiyas. What is al-qiyas? Al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir. What is al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir? Al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir, everything in this world is actually based off a certain paradigm, a certain pattern. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that what you see in this world, everything has a pattern, everything has this paradigm, and then therefore, in order to study one thing, sometimes put it in a classification, in a type of a classification, and you're going to base it off of that. And the Quran uses the paradigm system often, which is in fact the main evidence why even the scholars of fiqh used the evidence of qiyas, or analogy, even in fiqh, in studying Islamic law. And they considered that the Quran itself is basically giving us the inspiration that everything is based off a certain paradigm, In fact, you had scholars that actually wrote books that were called Al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir. Al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir simply means the things that are similar, the things that are nadha'ir, the things that are basically having a specific paradigm. They basically take the same evidence. They take the same ruling. They take the similar roots, whether in the analogy and so forth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving us this inspiration that everything in this world is created within the paradigm of the binary, or within the system of analogy, in where you've got one piece and then you would base different things on it. Same thing when we study physics, same thing when we study chemistry, same thing when we study biology. There is a classification and you would use that. You would look at the different chemical things, elements. We've got an atomic number, we've got a certain electron, proton, etc., neutrons, etc. We've got basically different things that we need to figure out, because we could see a system that is there. Without the system, we would not have actually understood the world if this system was constantly was in constant change. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, in where the system that you see within the creation is not to be applied on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the Lord Almighty is لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's nothing like unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore it is doing two things. There's the affirmation piece of it, and there's also the other piece, which is the negation. So you would consider and remember that وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, that the Lord Almighty has all the good names, and therefore any name that expresses any form of a reduction, any form of a regression, any form of a humility or condescending expression on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually be something that we have to negate on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unjust is basically against Islam, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only has al-asma'ul husna, walillahi al-asma'ul husna. But then you also have to do what is called an affirmation. And the affirmation, in where you're basically affirming that certain names for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then you have to believe in those names. You basically affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has these names, such as here, you basically do not do ta'atil. What is ta'atil? Ta'atil is basically negating the names. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. You affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all hearing and all seeing. لَهُ مَقَالِيدُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Well, not only is he all seeing and all hearing, but the Lord Almighty, to explain it, yes, this is in terms of his essence, but له مقاليد السماوات والأرض, to him basically belongs all the function. So when you're looking at maqalid, yes, it means khaza'in, as right here, it basically says khaza'in, which means the control of all the different things in the skies and on earth. But this is in order to say that all the forces that you would see in the skies, in the galaxies, in the solar systems and other solar systems that we probably don't know of, or even on earth, the force itself is actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not the matter. The matter itself does not in itself make the force. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives it the potential to cause and make the force. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَهُ مَقَالِدُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. You had learned that certain things have forces, but the true one to actually give the force to the sun, for example, you would see the sun is constantly basically burning what? Well, they'll say it's gases, but it's really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's giving it that potential. It's really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's giving it that potential. And in order to continue in the existence, whether the things in the skies or whether the things on earth, at the end of the day, they basically need a couple things. Number one, they need things to keep it sustained. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَبْسُطُ الرِّزْقِ. He is the one to give any form of of, let's call it the potential to be sustained, which is in rizq. But that's not enough to give a rizq. There has to be a particular amount. A particular amount. This is not just for human beings, but that's the same thing when we're talking about the different galaxies, when we're talking about the different things in biology, the different things in physics. Everything is all based on numbers. Everything is based on numbers. If any of those numbers change, then things will actually go into a complete malfunction. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَقْدِرْ, and look at that one in order to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives these particular amounts and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to determine these particular amounts. It basically needs one very important thing, إِنَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٍ. It needs the one that is basically encompassing all the knowledge. Encompassing all the knowledge. Now, this ayah and another ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is basically Ayat Al-Kursi. We've done this before, but I think it's really important to go to it every single time, because once you actually connect these two parts of it, that's how you're capable of understanding when you look at the ayah, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Now you look at Allah لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ الْحَيُّ الْقَيُّومُ لَا تَأْخُذُهُ سِنَةٌ وَلَا نَوْمٌ. Now one thing is that when you look at Ayat al-Kursi, you've got the first piece of it in where it is laying out the essence. Sorry about that. Laying out the essence of the Lord Almighty, in where in order to understand that the essence of the Lord Almighty is not like the essence of anything that is created. So that's why it's emphasizing Allah, the Lord Almighty, the deity. That's where the word Al-Ilah comes from, which is the word Allah. It is Al-Ilah. When we're the God, the deity, the one that people worship, the one that people recognize that they need to turn to, La ilaha illahu. His essence is not like of anything that you see in the world around you. Why? Because remember in Surah Shura, where it was basically telling you that he is the one that خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا وَمِنَ الْأَنْعَامِ أَزْوَاجًا. Well, he created you in binary, but the Lord Almighty is the only one that is non-binary. He is the only one that you cannot apply the same rules and the same laws of physics or the laws of nature or the laws of biology. You do not apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why La ilaha illahu. There's no God worthy of worship but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the same time, this is in order to confirm where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you He is Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. Everything in the world would only exist only if it had the potential, a specific energy to give it life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is Al-Hayy. Life for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is Al-Hayy. He is the one that brings life. He is the one that is Al-Qayyum. His existence is not dependent on anybody. He is Al-Qayyum, in where existence, He is the one that encompasses it at the same time, so that you would not think that a part of a weakness or a part of losing potential is applied on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then emphasizes this ayah and says, لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. In case you confuse the matters and you thought that the Lord Almighty goes through what other things in nature go through and go in basically losing energy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, well, not the part of a sleep and not a deep or a complete sleep falls on the Lord Almighty, in where the Lord Almighty is beyond any type of weakness. The Lord Almighty has all the power, and therefore, and that actually resulted in the Lord Almighty having the ownership. The ownership, له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. To Him belongs. This is equivalent to the ayah that we were just doing. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. Everything in the skies and even on earth belongs to the Lord Almighty. So therefore, once that you consider and you basically recognize that the ownership goes to the Lord Almighty, you would then recognize that the worship only belongs to the Lord Almighty. So therefore, no one is capable of interceding to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the only deity, he is the only one to accept or reject any form of intercession. Why? Because the Lord Almighty has the knowledge of what is, number one, ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم, what is in front of them or what is in between their hands or what is behind them, what is even in their past. In other words, it is in front, in place, and it is in front, in time, future. This is ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم, in place, what you literally have behind you, or what is in the past of your own existence in terms of time. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you here that the knowledge basically goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no one actually has this type of potential in knowledge but the Lord Almighty, since he is beyond time and also beyond place, giving the people وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ, where nothing goes and is capable of encompassing the knowledge of the Lord Almighty إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ, and the knowledge that you are granted or that you are given is basically only by the will of the Lord Almighty. Well, so that you would just get an idea, now you recognize the ownership of the Lord Almighty. You recognize the knowledge of the Lord Almighty. You recognize that the Lord Almighty's knowledge encompasses beyond time. You recognize that all the worship goes to the Lord Almighty. Then this is to give you the idea of the essence of the Lord Almighty. Now, to get the picture even closer to you, the Lord Almighty did not tell you how and what his essence really looks like. So he just tells you, well, I want to give you an idea just about my throne. Just the throne itself for the Lord Almighty basically is beyond and more expensive than the skies and the earth themselves. But the Lord Almighty, in terms of preservation for all the skies and the earth and everything that is in them, the Lord Almighty, to him, he is never incapable of giving them preservation. In order to recognize the essence of the Lord Almighty, there comes that most important name, Al-Ali Al-Azim, the Most High and the Most Magnificent. This is basically the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a nutshell, just to basically understand when we're speaking about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're going in these categories. You're understanding the essence. He is Al-Ali Al-Azim. He is beyond, he is the most magnificent, and beyond time, beyond place, beyond knowledge, encompassing all the knowledge, encompassing all the power, because to him belongs all the ownership, and therefore even anyone that might have actually went into considering that they are getting any form of closeness to the Lord Almighty, it would only be through him approving it or disproving it. So that's why when you look at this ayah, وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَإِلَى اللَّهِ تُرْجَعُ الْأُمُورِ. What is that? That's exactly in the light of Ayatul Kursi, in order to say in everything actually belongs, whether in the skies or whether on earth, it goes back to the Lord Almighty. Then therefore, إِلَى اللَّهِ تُرْجَعُ الْأُمُورِ, all the different matters should go for the Lord Almighty. Why? Because whether we're speaking about worship, here we go, whether we're speaking about the essence, or whether we're speaking about the ownership, or whether we're speaking about the knowledge, or whether we're speaking about the encompassment, or whether we're speaking about the preservation, or whether we're speaking about the worship. Therefore, the worship goes to the Lord Almighty, because the word worship is definitely far more expensive than ritual. You want to bet? I know this is the sloppiest handwriting. I'll get an A plus in the sloppy handwriting. Preservation, yeah, supposedly. So now I guess I'll definitely be a doctor. There can't be any sloppier than that. The thing is that when you've got a screen, it's hard to actually write on the screen, and it's not like you've got a pen. All right. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس. You were the best of the nation. That was, the word is أخرجت للناس. What is أخرجت? أخرجت means it was brought to the people. Why brought to the people? Basically because the prophets and the messengers basically ended. Who was supposed to be taking over in completing and proselytizing the legacy of the prophets and the messengers? Well, that's basically the ummah. That's basically the nation, the Muslim nation. Why would they even be responsible for that? Or responsible for what? Well, they would not be the best of the nations unless they basically applied two very important things. تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. You would order for what is good and you would forbid what is evil. Now, it's really important to mention when we're speaking about ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil, it's very important to remember. So, on a condition that you would recognize that the one to actually consider and to define what is munkar, what is evil, and what is ma'ruf is basically that you would return it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, you would use the definition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you to make sure that you're understanding things correctly. وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. And you would believe in the Lord Almighty, because believing in the Lord Almighty is supposed to be the key to helping you identify al-ma'ruf and also al-munkar. Belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the place to help you identify these things. What is the evidence? We always say that the epistemology in Islam goes through three different things. يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسِ, which is al-hawa, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى, which is al-wahy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us that majority of the people would use speculation. What is speculation? Speculation is basically when the mind may come to a specific understanding of something and think that it is the reality, when in reality, what it is really containing speculation. Yesterday, I was actually listening to a lecture about David Hume's David Hume's philosophy, and it was talking about how he was regarding the opposite way. Really, il-hawa is supposed to be the place of knowledge and not the other way around. So it's il-hawa. So, well, he doesn't call it il-hawa, but he would actually call it feelings. So we're basically motivated by feelings. So if you really want to control the masses, you don't control the masses by giving them a good argument. You would basically control the masses by giving them, a sensation, a feeling, a sentiment. That's how you control the people. And that's actually quite true in some way, in where what is happening right now is that you're controlling the people by giving them a specific type of emotion and not necessarily the argument. And that's what's happening. Most people, indeed, they would follow al-hawa, and they would let il-hawa and their sensation determine their understanding. It would let their sensation determine their understanding. They're feeling good about something, so therefore, what do? They feel good about it, so then they're going to give this argument to support that it's basically logical, that it's basically right. All right, that's the same thing. And where today's lobbies basically work on that. And of course, David Hume is one of the most skeptic people that even believe in God, but, just an aside. So the other thing is that Islam regarded that, no, it's not the dhann, and certainly not necessarily your speculation that determines right or wrong, and is not necessarily a credible source of knowledge to understand the world through, which is basically dhann. Because the second that you might think your mind is credible to give you the source to understand the world, you would not recognize that your brain is not necessarily 100% subjective, but it actually contains a lot of objectivity. It contains a lot of different things that can influence your mind. And without you recognizing, whether it's your age, whether it's your experience, whether it's your mood, your so many, the country that you come from, the culture that you come from, all these different things can actually influence your mind and how it finally and eventually generates a certain and a particular thought. So therefore, the brain is not necessarily 100% subjective. The end of the day, although we want to be convinced that it's the brain that basically is and has the complete power to determine right and wrong, but at the end of the day, we know for a fact that our own brains basically are influenced by so many different factors. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, that's actually called the dhann, speculation, because your brains cannot be 100% credible to be the resources to help you identify the world around you. The other part is al-hawa. In terms of al-hawa, whether the feelings that you generate on regarding to different things, whether in regards to people, how you judge someone, how you judge the different definitions of morality, whether you judge so many different things, of course, al-hawa. And we know that so many different things can influence our hawa, can influence our feelings. And of course, we know how our feelings can generate and change from one time to another. So in other words, they're pretty much similar to the brain in how it generates and fluctuates, and of course is influenced by the different, let's call it external factors that can actually alter how it defines right and wrong. But al-wahy is simply the only source that does not change, and it's outside of your brain, outside of your feelings, and certainly it's even outside of creation. Why? Because أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. Isn't the one that the one that created and that is most subtle and that is all-knowing, the Lord Almighty, the only one to have the right to give the rules, to give al-ahkam, to give the truth and assign the truth. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, in order to recognize, in order for what is good and forbidding what is evil, it's really important that the crux of the matter, the main source and the main center of the matter is really belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But don't the people of the book already believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلَوْ آمَنَ أَهْلُ الْكِتَابِ لَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُمْ. If the people of the book would have actually believed, it would have been better for them. Why? Because, let's see, مِنْهُمُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَأَكْثَرُهُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Most of them, some of them are actually believers. Wait a minute, so some of the people of the book are believers? Well, those are the ones that actually had embraced Islam. They had a history of being of Ahl al-Kitab, and later they embraced Islam. Those are the ones that actually became the mu'minun. Not that if a person can become a Christian and be a Christian and us calling them mu'minun, but this is actually saying that there are some from those that had a history of being Ahl al-Kitab. Some of them had actually embraced faith, and the majority of them had actually embraced al-fisq. Now, when we're speaking about al-fisq, there's really a lot to say about al-fisq, because al-fisq, like initially, al-fisq basically is to detach and exacerbate the peel away from the core, away from the fruit. So if you're taking away the fruit, you're taking away the peel, and then in that situation, you're exposing the fruit to the different probably elements of heat, temperature, change in temperature, probably different things that are probably going to be penetrating that fruit, and then that is going to expose it to decay even faster. In other words, al-fisq is supposed to be something in where it is, number one, it is the opposite of Iman. Number two, it is the opposite of Islam. It can be the opposite of Iman, and it could also be the opposite of Islam. And this is extremely important to say, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ كَفَرَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Whoever disbelieves in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then those are the people that are al-fasiqun. So therefore, al-fisq can be the antonym of Islam and can also be the antonym of Iman. The antonym of Islam and the antonym of Iman. The antonym of Islam would basically be kufr. The antonym of Iman would basically be the fasiq. So what's a mu'min anyways? A mu'min is basically a person that is consistent, determined on practicing Islam. That's a mu'min. Determined, consistent, committed to practicing Islam. So they basically recognize the ayah is saying, for example, aqimu salah. They would perform salah. The ayah is saying, O Prophet of Allah, tell your wives, the believing women, tell your wives, the believing women, to wear their hijab. They would do it. That's a mu'min. All right. Now, here's one thing. When we're speaking about the antonym of al-fasiq, where it relates to Iman, it's really important to consider that if a person is publicly displaying that particular sin, if it's a Muslim, publicly displaying this particular sin, then in that situation, they would be fasiq.
Major sins, minor sins, they not show.
Major sins, minor sins?
About doing major sin publicly, major, minor sins.
So al-mu'min abstains from major sins being done in public and even minor sins of course, in their private as well. So this is for al-mu'min. They would abstain as much as they can. They're not consistent with, even if they were to do a major sin, they would still repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is it possible that they can actually commit a sin? Well, it's possible. It can happen that they can commit a sin, but they wouldn't be committed to it. They wouldn't be consistent with it. It happened, they regret it, and they would continue living the level and the pattern of Iman that they had embraced. Go ahead, Sister Zainab. Gives me a time to drink water.
So what's the difference between fasad?
Good question. The difference between al-fisq and al-fasad. So in general, al-fasad is basically when you are acting or you are practicing a certain practice that is not part of the nature that it was intended for. That's al-fasad. So for example, where you would say people, all right, when you're looking at, you would see people probably, you would see people where they're probably practicing zina. Islam basically assigned that marital relations would be the safe space in order to create family. So anybody practicing what is against the nature of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended, the different things in nature, that would be fasad. Il-fisq, on the other hand, definitely is part of il-fasad, but not necessarily as, let's call it, as apparent at many times in the same way. So il-fisq is when the person is acting against his own nature himself, and at the same time, they're consistent with that. So example, when a person, just like when they're probably drinking, all right? So what are they doing? They're actually exposing themselves, exposing their heart to this particular behavior. And what is it? It's basically against their own nature. Yes, this is fasad, talking about it from the angle of a general communal description, but al-fisq is more of an individual side. The individual side, this person is fasiq. All right. Al-fisq is the action. Al-fisq is the action. Al-fasad is more of a description in the community. All right. Generally in the community. But لَن يَضُرُّكُمْ إِلَّا أَذًى. Now, this is extremely important to look into. لَن يَضُرُّكُمْ إِلَّا أَذًى. Why and what does it have to do with لَن يَضُرُّكُمْ إِلَّا أَذًى? Because the ayah was actually describing one very important thing. It was telling you, well, you have the obligation to order for what is good and forbid what is bad. But then don't assume that when you order for what is good and forbid what is bad, do not whatsoever assume that you're going to be left alone to propagate the good and the piety that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asked you to propagate. They're not going to leave you alone. They will fight you. They will put the different pressures in order to stop you. They've got their agenda, and you have to have your agenda. Their agenda comes from al-hawa. Their agenda comes from al-fisq. Their agenda comes from al-fasad. But you have to do your work in order to push back and basically guide the masses on the other hand, in order to guide them on haqq. You have to do your job to guide the masses on doing what is right. Because on the other side, you're going to find a huge matrix. You're going to find a huge area that is also practicing a form of conspiracy to instill within the society the different fisq, the different fasad, the different things that are anti and against people's nature and against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles and against the principles in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically put, whether we're speaking about the deen or whether we're speaking about people's lives or whether we're speaking about people's mental health. And even though we're right now seeing this mental health becoming more of an industry use, but at the end of the day in Islam, it does consider that using different substances, or even when we're speaking about mental health, Islam does consider that a very important piece of it in order to make sure that we have people that are sober in their thinking and capable of using their intellect to do what is right. And at the same time, in where we're getting a society that is stable in its chastity and forming the families that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created reproduction for, and at the same time, making and bringing in the economical justice within the society. So therefore, you will see an opposition from those areas that will try to work in putting the different adha. What is adha? Adha is harm. Adha is harm. They will attempt to harm you, probably in trying to affect and bringing in misconceptions in your deed. They will affect you in your life. They will affect you in your life, probably pressuring you to lose probably your job, or probably not giving you the spaces to embrace the piety and the religion and the principles of the Lord Almighty. They will also affect you in schools and in universities without you recognizing. It will be something that will still bring in the adha to harm you mentally, to harm you psychologically, to tell you if you don't obey, if you don't follow our own pressures, we don't follow our system, that you will be targeted. Not only in that, but your family is going to be targeted as well. And where your own life, your own family, if you don't do what we tell you, we're going to take away your children. We're going to indoctrinate them in schools. We're going to do this. We're going to basically use this form and this method to bring in the other, to let you have no choice but to succumb to our own darar, to our own laws, to our own system. If you still insist, oh, we will use the system and wealth to make sure that you abide and that you succumb to our rules. That's basically the system in where they will use all these different things, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, don't be afraid. Maintain your definition. Let's put them all together. Maintain your deen and your definition of justice. Be patient and don't succumb to the different situations that they might actually try to pressure you to give up on your deen, and keep cool, because they will give you lots of offers in order to give up on your deen. So maintain your iffah. Don't give up. They will give you different offers in order to convince you to give up on your deen. And finally, always maintain the courage in order to recognize that there's no way that you can maintain the power to proselytize, to do the da'wah, to stand, to live, to be steadfast, and live in the principle of the Lord Almighty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, be careful. I want you to recognize that the harm that they might put on you is just adha. Yes, there will be some harm, but this harm is just outer, external. This harm is going to be very temporary. In fact, in fact, and even if they were to go deep, and even if they were to fight, they'll actually run away. In other words, you might think that these groups are so powerful, but the reality is, it's just an appearance that appears like it's powerful, but the inside is weak. The inside is weak because they themselves recognize the discrepancies in their thoughts, because they themselves recognize that they don't actually have a strong foundation in the argument, a strong foundation in the unity, and that it's all based on hawa. And when it's all based on hawa, when it's all based on desire, if that is that person's God, if the person's God is desire and hawa, then certainly every single person was actually born with a certain level of shuh. What is this shuh? Greed. Greed. We all have our greed. So these people, if they worship their own desire would act as the main separator between them and other people and their own selves, because that person and the other person cheating is going to be very common. Why? Well, because they don't even have a definition of akhlaq. And once we lose trust in one another, once our God becomes our own desire, then in that situation, you can't trust me anymore, because you would recognize that once I would desire something out of you, I know no boundary. I would know no boundary. Why? Because there would be no subjective morality in that situation. When there's no subjective morality, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, ثُمَّ لَا يُنصَرُونَ. ثُمَّ لا ينصرون. Then they would not actually be victorious. Yes, it might actually take some time. I want you to recognize that in Lugha Arabiya, the word thumma is different than the letter fa, because thumma actually tells us that it can happen that there is a time lapse while they're putting in their pressures to change us, while they're putting in the pressures to basically try to separate us from the principle. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, it could be years, it could be 100 years, it could be even more, but it's all dependent on one, how steadfast you are in connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because at the end of the day, in order to be a person that will qualify for the victory, for in nusra, for the victory, you basically have to be a person that is living the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and certainly that considers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as their place to get victory from, because the second that you would basically use your own self, you would not recognize little by little that you're actually using your own power by you yourself, just succumbing to yourself and not depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in other words, if you want to get the power from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, you would really have to live in getting the inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and living and abiding by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders and not by your orders. And that's where you would actually qualify man kana yuridu al-izza فَلِلَّهِ الْعِزَّةُ جَمِيعًا. If you actually wanted the honor, then the honor is all belonging to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you want to qualify for that, well, you gotta then recognize that you need to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to qualify for it. And at the same time, the Umar ibn al-Khattab had actually said, نَحْنُ قَوْمٌ أَعَزَّنَ اللَّهُ بِالْإِسْلَامِ. We are people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us the honor بالإسلام, only if we were to abide by Islam. فإن ابتغينا العزة لغير الله أذن الله. If we seeked the honor from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would humiliate us. What is نحن قوم أعزنا الله بالإسلام actually? What does it actually mean? That in order right there, look at this ayah. The ayah says, ثُمَّ لَا يُنصَرُونَ. They would not actually be getting the victory. They would not qualify for victory. When? When they're fighting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would not actually get the victory. If you too are fighting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't expect getting victory either. That's why Umar ibn Khattab said, we're actually people where we're getting the victory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once we depart the victory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, once we depart Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then don't expect getting victory. Don't expect getting victory if you basically separate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Imam al-Shafi'i said, من لم تعزه التقوى فلا عز له. If a person did not get his honor from taqwa, then they would not actually have any honor. Because true honor only comes from taqwa. True honor only comes when the person is basically abiding by the principles of the Lord Almighty. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was also telling us right there, Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu. The Lord Almighty is basically the authority of الذين آمنوا, or those that believe. What about them? يخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور. It's all about He's taking them out of the darkness into the light. Once they are actually living by the light, that's when they would be capable of recognizing what leads to light, what leads to victory, what leads to success, what leads to guidance. But if they're actually not living based on that, then they're going to be not any different from those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had fought. Who did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fight? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fought who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fought those that basically fight him. So if a person is fighting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then in that situation, they would expect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not giving them the favors of Nasr, is not giving them the favors of guidance, is not giving them the favors of rahmah, of mercy in dunya or even in akhirah. So what are we actually speaking about in Nusra? What is Nusra? What is victory? Victory is basically one, victory in this dunya, victory in our own selves. In other words, we are having the upper hand, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about military, whether we're talking about governance, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about on ground administration, or whether we're talking about the society itself and how unified it is. Not only until we go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would we actually be successful on an individual level and on a community level and on a nation level. نحن قوم أعزنا الله بالإسلام. We're people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us honor only through Islam. If we seek honor through other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our consequence, the result, is that we're going to be أذلة. إن ابتغينا العزة لغير الله أذلنا الله. If we basically seek other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we're here looking into money, we're here looking into just political activism, just because we want to somehow get an advancement, then in that situation, expect to actually be in loss. Expect to face regression. Expect to face all the different sorrows. Because if you seek it through other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you wanted to live your own principle. And that happens a lot when we're looking at, right now, activists. What are they active about? We just want to put in a hijabi. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, we like that idea. I'm sure you like the hijabi. But then the hijabi is basically dancing in a pride concert or whatever it is. You're contradicting it. That's not ibtaghayna al-izzah. This is not putting al-izzah through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're putting your izzah through the LGBT. The second thing you put, and you are trying to seek power through this group, then recognize that you will be left to their power. You would be left to their dhillah. Once they are humiliated, you too will be humiliated. So what is the main thing that we're supposed to be doing? The main thing that you are supposed to be doing is really working, despite all the opposition that might be there. The main thing that you're supposed to be working on is trying to continue the Prophet's legacy. Despite all the opposition, you're supposed to continue that principle, announcing that principle, announcing haqq. That's the main duty that you have. But I'll be facing some pressures. Yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that. He told you, don't worry. It's just going to be very momentarily. It's just going to be some kind of harm, but it will not necessarily affect the success of how your matter goes. ضربت عليهم الذلة. Pay attention to this one. ضربت عليهم الذلة أينما ثقفوا إلا بحبل من الله وحبل من الناس. وباءوا بغضب من الله وضربت عليهم المسكنة ذلك بأنهم كانوا يكفرون بآيات الله ويقتلون الأنبياء بغير حق ذلك بما عصوا وكانوا يعتدون. So what does that actually mean? I'm going to first do a translation, a surface translation, and then we're going to get deeper. ضربت عليهم الذلة. What is الذلة? What is ضربت? ضربت actually means to strike. So they were struck with humility wherever they may be, except by a rope from Allah and a rope from the people. Now, remember, this is a wrong translation. This is a literal translation. We're going to get deeper in just a bit. وَبَاءُوا بِغَضَبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. And the consequence is that they stayed within the anger of the Lord Almighty, and they were struck with pity. For that is because they used to disbelieve in the verses of the Lord Almighty, and they killed the prophets with no right. And that is for what the sin that they had committed and all the transgression that they committed. Well, this is a very, very bad translation. Let me explain why. Because when you actually say duribat, and it's really important to mention that yes, in Arabic there is the literal meaning, and there's also the figurative meaning, the metaphor and the simile and all these different things, or the hyperbole, etc. But in Arabic, whether we're talking about the figurative meaning or whether we're talking about the literal meaning, they actually take from one another. So when you look at duribat, yes, this is not necessarily to say literally where, here's a person where they would strike them give them some kind of a strike where they're given some form of humility. This is not at all like that, but this is also taking from that meaning as well. So what is a darb? And how does it happen? الضرب actually goes and penetrates in the body. الضرب, when you actually strike or you would stamp something, it goes and is stamped and it becomes part of it. It goes inside. It basically, what is that called? It's like embroidered in it. Goes deep inside. So that's a darb right there. A dhilla. They were embroidered or they were struck, and it went and penetrated deep down, which is the humility. This is really interesting because when you actually speak of different moralities, yes, this is talking about the Jews and the Christians, but then it's really important to learn that when we're talking about morality, that some morality is basically part of our DNA. Other morality, it's basically our behavior, and it goes inside and penetrates us, and it becomes as if it was struck in us. Struck in us. Wait a minute, so where did you get the part about some morality as part of the DNA? Remember in Mundhir ibn al-Ashaj ibn Qais hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ tells him, Inna fika khislatayn. There are two morals in you, Allah and His Messenger love in you. And he said, what are they? And he said, Al-hilmu wal-ana. Al-hilm wal-ana. It's basically forbearance and gentleness. You don't rush things. You just let things be done in the way that it's time for it to be done. You don't rush things. Forbearance. You would just let go. You can retaliate, but you choose to live the akhlaq and not the emotion, not the impulsivity that might overcome you at that moment. So you are forbearant. That's the first one.
But then the most important question that he asked, he said, أخلقين تخلقت بهما أم جبلني الله عليهما? Are they morals that I disciplined myself into, or are they manners that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in me? And the Prophet responds, بل جبلك الله عليهما. As a matter of fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them in you. So that basically tells us that some morality indeed is actually prevalent and is part of a certain group of people.
And Allah created it.
It created, and you will pass, it is passed on to you. You will see a certain tribe. These people are just down to earth. Another tribe, they're just by their DNA, just people, they're just arrogant. Other people, it's part of their DNA in where they're just people that are hospitable. Other people, it's part of their DNA where they're always fearing poverty to the point that they're very, very greedy. Part of their DNA. They pass it on, and it continues, and you don't recognize it. Now, this is not at all to enforce tribalism. No, this is not to enforce tribalism, but this is just for us to recognize certain things and certain behaviors that we may not recognize that is in us, probably passed on, but it doesn't mean that if I got some form of a trait from my ancestor, it doesn't mean that I say, well, I got it from my ancestor, I'm not responsible for it. No. Why? Because if you were not responsible for changing it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not have asked you to change into a certain behavior. So certain behaviors you can adapt to changing them and adapt to certain behaviors to become a better person. And certain behaviors, they may be within you and you basically probably do a better job than other people that probably adapted to them. In other words, let's give an example. I'm not somebody that's very good in math, but can I probably learn math? I can probably learn math, but I will most likely not master it as somebody else that is probably just from the very early childhood, these people were just built in their brain where they were just people of math. I can adapt, I can learn, but I'm probably not going to be as good. Some people, their DNA is just brain engineered into math. And that's the same thing. Intelligence, you'll see certain people actually from father till their ancestor, they were just into medical studies. A whole family, doctors. It's part of their DNA where they just happen to get the GPA high, I guess. Lucky them. Does that mean I cannot do an extra homework to probably get there? Well, you can really try. I might fail a couple times, but hey, you can work harder. All right, you can adapt. Maybe I can change that mutation that somehow happened somewhere in my ancestry, and I can start a new gene. I can start a new mutation. Exactly. I can start a new mutation, affect a new generation. Who knows? That's the same thing in where, yes, you can learn and unlearn certain things, even if they are part of you. If that was not the case, it would not make any sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would ask us to adapt, to learn new akhlaq. And that's what we had seen the Sahaba actually form. We had seen that the Sahaba were born in a certain society that was uneducated, that was engaging in all forms of injustice, that was engaging in so many different left and right behaviors. But it wasn't until Islam had come in, it basically gave them a new change. In other words, you can, by putting in a form of consistency, a form of determination, and create that you can create a commitment to adapt to a new behavior. And this is extremely important when we look at ضربت عليهم الذلة. In other words, yes, this ayah is saying that they were struck with humility. They were humiliated. They were struck with some form of feeling that they're low. Why low? Low in what? They were basically low because remember here when it was talking about Yunsarun, that they will not actually be victorious. Why won't they be victorious? Because the second that you go against the laws of the Lord Almighty, expect that you're putting in this energy, by definition, it's going to go wasted. You're not going to win because you're fighting your own self. You're fighting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're fighting your own self. When you fight your own self and you fight Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're basically determining then that you're just going to be humiliated because your energy is going to take you low, not high. Your energy is wasted. You're just going, you're trying to go up, but in reality, you don't recognize that you're actually going further down. What is up and down? Down is basically when you go down in your akhlaq, down in your iman. Up, وَلِلَّهِ الْعِزَّةِ وَلِرَسُولِهِ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Izzah and honor and elevation could only be acquired through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives it to himself, to the Prophet, and to the believers. So therefore, once they actually think that they're going up, and this is extremely important when we're talking about energy, they would think they're going up, and in reality, they're just going down. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, we talked about this last time, in where there's invested energy and wasted energy. Invested energy and wasted energy. How's that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us that وَإِن تُطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ لَا يَلِتْكُمْ مِنْ أَعْمَالِكُمْ شَيْئًا. If you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger, لا يلتكم من أعمالكم شيئا. He would not ignore any of your actions, any of the energy that you had invested. Even if it doesn't get to the intended goal, yes. Even if it doesn't get there. You tried to raise your child to be good, but your child didn't actually make it to be. They didn't make it. Does that mean that your energy has gone wasted? No. They chose not to be good, but that doesn't mean your energy is wasted. Your energy is still there. Your deed is still there. Even if you don't get to the goal, the only wasted energy, even if it may get to the goal, is basically the energy that was not intended for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wait, what does that mean? The Prophet ﷺ in the hadith actually said, أول من تسعر بهم النار. The first people that will be exposed and hellfire lit on them are basically one, a scholar. What did he do? Well, he basically is there in a qari. He was memorizing the Quran. He memorized the Quran. And somebody that was doing jihad, and a person, and in fact, he died as a shaheed. And the fourth one is a person that was donating generously. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings them. The first one said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, why do you deserve Jannah? And he said, well, I basically learned and And people had known me to be a scholar. So the Prophet, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Kadhabt, you're a liar." Yes, you did get to, that is, you did get to the education. Yeah, you certainly got a bachelor's, master's, PhD, and all of that. And certainly people were very aware of your scientific and academic scores and goals that you got to. And people did know you for that. But that's not why you learned. You learned because you wanted the credit from people. Did this person get the credit? Did they actually get to the achievement? In people's eyes, yes. Let's go for the mujahid. He basically went through, hey, they got a military level and they were working, they were training, and they probably got to high military levels and they were definitely mastering it. They were doing an excellent job. They engage in jihad and they basically die in jihad too. And then when they meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they said, well, I basically was, fighting for you and that's why I deserve Jannah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them, no, you wanted to get the label of mujahid and you got it. The third one, the qari. You memorized the Quran, 10 qira'at and all of that. And he said, I did it for your sake. I got the ijazas and I got everything. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, you did it because you wanted to be labeled that way. You wanted to get the privilege from people, not from me, not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the final one, the donation. Yeah, he worked, definitely made a lot of money, donated, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, well, you donated not because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You donated because you wanted to be called that way. And that's the same thing. When you scrutinize this hadith, you could see that these people did actually get to what we would call today as a level of success. In other words, we would consider it as they basically got to the achievements, and it should not actually be called wasted energy. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it wasted energy, even though in the dunya definitions, we would consider that these people worked towards the mission, got the level, got their levels of success. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered it as wasted energy because it led them to hellfire. Riya, absolutely, because they seek people. And that's a very important thing to consider, which is the true wasted energy is basically when the intention is not done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if you did the right action, but if the intention was not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's wasted energy. On the other hand, if the person did not get to the goal, they didn't get to the goal. They tried to raise their children. They tried to study. They tried to learn. They tried to memorize. They didn't really memorize. In fact, the guy that killed 100, did he actually get to the goal? He didn't get to the goal. He killed 100. Then he is asked to move to another place. He tries to move to the other place, but in the middle of the way, he actually dies. Did he actually reach the destination? He didn't. Did he really get anywhere? He didn't even get anywhere. He didn't even do anything. He was just in the middle of the way, barely. But that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still rewards him and considered that he had reached his destination. Why? Even though technically he didn't. Technically he didn't. But it was the sincerity that made even the smallest amount of energy as invested energy to get you to the destination. Even the smallest amount of energy. It's a very small amount, but that small amount, it contained the barakah. It contained the acceptance. That's why when we actually speak about wasted energy and invested energy, it's not necessarily by did you get to your goal or not. You do the work. Just put the work. Don't worry about the results. The results will come on their own when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it to come. If it's khair, you do what you need to do and let the rest on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let the rest be on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, ma'am. Raise your voice, sweetheart.
Okay, so for example, Quran, if you're a parent, for me, I try to take the kids to Quran first because Allah is going to ask, how do is that part of the intention too? Because my worry is not the results with Allah. Whether they choose to pick, that's their responsibility. I just want to face Allah and say, you know what, Allah.
That is exactly it, Zamzam. You know, one thing, that's exactly it, Zamzam. Are we necessarily going to guarantee that our children will make the choice to choose Iman? No. But we have to do the work. We have to do the work. And guess what? You have to do the work. You don't necessarily wait. And even if your children, la samahallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid such a thing from happening. Even if our children made the choice to choose otherwise, you're not held accountable. At least you did your job. I tried, and always tell your children, I'm just trying to take you to Jannah. That's my main goal. I'm trying to take you to Jannah. That's all I'm trying to do. I don't have anything else. I'm trying to take you to Jannah. Why am I doing this? I'm basically trying to teach you the keys to Jannah. Why are you scrutinizing me this much? Why are you putting me under this strong scrutiny? Well, I'm just trying to make sure that no fitna gets to you, my dear. Why are you always investigating? Because I'm trying to get you to Jannah. Why are you asking me to do these things? Because I'm trying to discipline you to make sure that you recognize akhlaq. But let me get into the argument and into understanding the argument. I can teach you some of the argument about understanding akhlaq, but at the end of the day, even if you don't get to the argument, you still have to practice it. Even if you don't understand the argument, I have to force you to do what is right. Even if I don't understand it, yes. Even if I'm not convinced, don't be convinced. You'll one day expand your knowledge. One day you'll get mature and understand it. In the beginning, they're on the inside. They're basically going to see you like a narcissist personality that's somehow trying to force them against their will and all of that. At the end of the day, all I could do is let you recognize that certain discipline you may understand, another discipline you may not understand. And that's the same thing even in the government. You may not agree with everything that the law says, but you recognize you still have to abide by it. You recognize that there's a price to pay if you don't. That's no different from the rules that we put at home. We recognize that certain akhlaq, we may recognize the logic behind them, and other akhlaq, we don't recognize the logic behind it. Tell me, why do you pray dhuhr for 4 rak'ahs? Why are we standing in Mina, then Muzdalifah, or Arafah, Mina, Muzdalifah? Why are we even going through these areas? Why that particular place? Why not Brooklyn Center, then Brooklyn Park, then probably go to New Hope? And why not there? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said so. The end of the day is that when we do al-manasik, we're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined it. And that's the same thing, that not always do you necessarily understand all the different details of all the different rulings.
You don't see God, but you believe in God.
You see the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, let's continue. أينما ثقفوا. So what happened, and this is extremely important, is it possible that certain moralities can later generate in us because of a sin. Absolutely. Certain moralities are generated with a particular sin. And certain moralities at the same time can be generated because of a certain khair. So if a person, for example, does qiyam al-layl, that will generate a certain akhlaq. I was listening to,
Can you explain more?
let's do it right there. I'm going to say a story, maybe a little irrelevant, but it just occurred to me right now. Al-Dhahabi, a very important scholar that also learned through Ibn Taymiyyah, basically said a story about a guy named Abu Mas'ud. This man, whenever he would get into a dispute with anybody, and they would come apologize, or they would see them, or somebody brings it up, he would just say, Al-madi la yudhkar. The past, we don't mention it. It's like, don't mention it, don't worry about it. To the point that he was basically into this habit. Every time he would just, it's just on his tongue. Al-madi la yudhkar. You know, when somebody always says a particular thing, they're constantly always saying it. The past, we don't mention it. Later, this man dies. And he was seen in a dream that he was asked, what happened to you? He said, oh, I basically stood in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, the past, we don't mention it. And he was taken to Jannah. The past, we don't mention it. Khalas. Everything's gone. Ya Allah, Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. The past, we don't mention. Khalas. Everything that you had done, it's not going to be mentioned. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those. May Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. Now, when you look at that, you know, there is a masjid in Turkey. It's called Ka'anni Akalt. Ka'anni Akalt. This is, in Arabic, it means as if I had eaten. As if I had eaten. What is the story of this masjid? This man, whenever he basically has the desire to eat something, he would take the money that is equivalent to the price of whatever he wants to eat and basically put it in like a little bank to save it. And he would say, as if I had eaten, and would put it until he basically had a lot of money that is ka'anni akalt, as if I had eaten, and used that money to build a masjid where he called it ka'anni akalt, as if I had eaten. And you know, I take that from there in where, how do you actually generate and let a certain iman in you, a certain vision in you, generate a certain akhlaq without you recognizing? It generates a certain akhlaq. Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he had become Muslim, before his Islam, he was known as this unjust tyrant, a very tough person, a person that knew no emotions. But after he had become Muslim, Islam provoked in him a new types of moralities. The total opposite, in where he was named Al-Faruq, to mean the person that is distinguishing between right and wrong. Al-Faruq, he was a person known to being the person to always do whatever it takes to deliver justice, to fight for justice. This person was fighting for nothing but tyranny. Now this person is with Iman. They had totally changed their akhlaq. And we say that all the time, where when the light of Iman comes into their heart, it starts changing little by little. The way they speak changes, the way they look changes, the way they gaze, the way they talk, the way they walk even changes. Let alone their mental health. That's why the Prophet ﷺ was always correlating, Allahumma inni as'aluka fi'l al-khayrat. Ya Allah, I ask you to grant me the potential to do what is good, وترك المنكرات, and to leave what is evil, وحب المساكين, and to love the needy. Why? Because when you love what is good and you hate what is evil, that's going to generate another khuluq. حب المساكين, to be humble, to have humility, to have that humble feeling, in where you're recognizing, you're embracing people's pains, you're embracing people's feelings, you're down to earth with them. When you see that, what did it generate? فعل الخيرات, it generates a different feeling. Now, when you look at on the other side, in where المنكر, and that's why this ayah says, well, right there, أينما ثقفوا, wherever they may be, they will actually always be facing dhillah. Dhillah is basically where they will be humiliated. Humiliated wherever they may be. إلا بحبل من الله, only through a certain rule. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically giving them a certain confidence, a certain agreement, political agreement, through the Prophet ﷺ, when he had made a certain agreement with Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Khaybar. But then once they basically went against that political agreement, that's when they had lost any form of getting some level of victory, or at least some level of living at peace and security. وَحَبْلٍ مِّنَ النَّاسِ, and they're connected. Now, they would not be, what is it, dhillah? Dhillah, yes, it's to be humiliated. Not humility, but humiliated. Only if there was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed, that he would give them a certain level of security. And even when a certain agreement, political agreement, is done with certain people, later on, with the Muslims, they would probably do certain agreements with the Muslims and live as Ahl Dhimma. But وَبَاءُوا بِغَضَبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. Let's look into this one. But they basically lived بِغَضَبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had always let them live in complete ghadab, in anger. And we know, whether we're talking about anger, whether we're talking about contempt, whether we're talking about love, whether we're talking about justice, whether we're talking about authority, we would basically affirm it that it's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَضُرِبَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَسْكَنَةِ. And they were struck with maskana. What is the difference between maskana and dhillah? Dhillah is basically to be humiliated. Il-maskana is basically the method that they would use to seek others' emotions, and in order to live at a certain support, they would use the method of seeking pity, just like the LGBT. Be inclusive to us. You have to include us. You have to basically accept us the way we are, etc. It's all about using the method of maskana, creating a narrative of pity, trying to use the type of emotion by provoking an emotion. They're living in humility, and they're also living in trying to provoke in you and trying to use the method of pity. So what do they use? They use this form in order to create a narrative, in order to get to their method and their agenda. ذلك بأنهم كانوا يكفرون بآيات الله. Why do they even use that method? Why did they end up getting humiliated? And they would even use this type of maskana. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, that's because they would deny the Lord Almighty, deny the verses of the Lord Almighty, and they would kill the prophets and the messengers. بغير حق. Now, بغير حق is telling you this is not, is there any legit reason to kill prophets and the messengers? No. So this بغير حق is not telling you that there is a legitimate reason to kill prophets and messengers, but this is confirming that when they were killing the prophets and the messengers, that was an injustice that they were doing. That was an injustice that they were doing. ذلك بما عصوا, for that is for the transgression that they had done, the sin that they had committed, and they were كانوا يعتدون. I want you to look at a number of different things here. Hold on, let's look at this one. Pay attention to this one. This verb is present. This verb is present. This verb is present. This verb is past. Even though يكفرون, يقتلون, and يعتدون, those are present verbs. يعتدون means that they were committing transgression. All right? يكفرون, يقتلون, and يعتدون, those are all present. Even though يقتلون, it's not that they were right now killing, they had killed the prophets in the past. There weren't any more prophets for them to kill.
Yes.
And this is extremely important to keep in mind, because this ayah, there's a general rule in tafsir and even in fiqh. العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. Let's write it down. What is العبرة بعموم اللفظ? العبرة, let's write it down. العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. لا بخصوص السبب. So whenever we look at an ayah, the main theme of it is in the general statement and not in the particular incident that it happened in. It's a general statement. So you cannot necessarily say, well, this ayah was revealed to tell the women to wear hijab that was during Medina because the women back then were facing some form of discrimination because of the munafiqeen. So therefore, since right now we're not facing a form of discrimination, we don't have to wear hijab. No. العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. So then, you're not going to say, well, that was the context back then. You've got the context. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم. Today I have perfected the religion. That's it. You're not going to change it and say, well, let's look into that. You can't say, well, back then the women didn't have the knowledge about finances. That's why Islam actually said that it's 2 women equivalent to 1 witness in case of transactions. No, wait a minute. The ayah says, أن تضل إحداهما فتذكر إحداهما الأخرى. The ayah was really clear about it, that it was related to their biology. It was really clear about it. It was related to the women's biology. It was not related to their education or to their experience. It said, أن تضل إحداهما. For one of them may forget, and the other one is there to back up. Because when we're speaking about people's rights, we're talking about a fine thing relating to justice. This is not talking about patting people on the back, because instilling justice is supposed to be based on solid evidence, not on things that are not credible. When we know that a woman's biology and her anatomy has a higher susceptibility to forgetfulness, whether it's because of her hormones, whether it's because of her pregnancy, all these different things that can happen. Islam wanted to consider that justice is a very sacred thing. This is not an issue of being a misogynist or not, but that's in order to instill justice. And justice is sacred. So I need to make sure that I have credible resources to support a statement to bring it as evidence. If we know that a woman's anatomy is susceptible at different times in her body to actually have a higher level of forgetfulness, that's why when we look at al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bikhusus al-sabab, you cannot say that, well, that was then because they just didn't have the numbers that we have today. This is not related. You can't use that statement and say, well, that's because they didn't have the knowledge. Now, that's why when you actually look at that one right there, let's look at those. You've got number one, they were denying the verses of the Lord Almighty. They were killing the prophets and the messengers. But this is, again, كانوا يقتلون. They were killing. This is a present, but they've done that in the past, and where they attempted to kill Zechariah, they killed Prophet Yahya, they killed the past prophets. That was in the past. But this is actually saying يقتلون, in where when you're killing the prophets, you're not only killing the prophet himself, but you're killing the legacy. You're attempting to kill the legacy that they were standing up for, that they were working towards bringing to life. La ilaha illallah. Now, that's why these actions were actually considered as ya'tadun. It wasn't something in the past, but they were determined to continue such a behavior. Before they had, yes, they were doing, it wasn't just a past sin that they had committed, but they were determined, they were consistent in, one, denying the words of the Lord Almighty, killing the legacy of the prophets and killing the prophets, and they were continuing with practicing sin, and they were determined to continue with that type of behavior on and on and on and on. So that's why this ayah is combining a past and a present statement, in where, in order to understand this, in where idhilla and il-maskana, seeking pity, creating a narrative, but it's all a narrative of where they're humiliated. Don't fall for this narrative. You will see that they were worked towards kufr. They were worked towards fighting what the prophets and the messengers had come with. But you continue your path. Let's flip the ayah for the good people. Let's flip the ayah, all right? If ضربت عليهم الذلة, for the mu'mineen, it's going to be the opposite. For the mu'mineen, what's the opposite of dhillah? Izzah. وَلِلَّهِ الْعِزَّةُ وَلِرَسُولِهِ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَيْنَمَا ثُقِفُوا إِلَّا بِحَبْلٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. Well, this one's particular to them. وَبَاءُوا بِغَضَبٍ. What's the opposite of ghadab? Rida. Rida. So the mu'mineen would get the opposite of al-ghadab is al-rida. What is that? لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. That the Lord Almighty is content over al-mu'mineen. So what's the difference between al-rida and al-ghadab? Al-ghadab basically means you're going to be out of al-rahmah, out of the mercy. Al-ghadab basically means you will be leading yourself to the consequence of hellfire. Al-rida basically means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there to give you the mercy, always, to give you guidance, to give you light, and to pave the way for Jannah. Allahumma ameen. So let's see. وَضُرِبَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَسْكَنَةِ. The opposite of al-maskana comes with it, al-izzah. Al-maskana comes with what? Comes with it, al-power. Comes with it, الولاية. So what do what does a believer do? A believer doesn't fall in this seeking pity. What does a mu'min do? No, they will speak in power, my dear. They don't speak in pity. They speak in power. They speak in strength. They speak in quwwah. They speak in the upper hand. They don't seek pity. They will say, we need this. They'll be strong. Today I'm hyper. Today. ذلك بأنهم, for the مؤمنين, what's the opposite of يكفرون بآيات الله? يؤمنون بآيات الله. يقتلون الأنبياء بغير الحق. They would do what? Believe in الأنبياء. They would believe in الأنبياء. What do? Basically revive the legacy of the prophets. We're flipping the ayah. العصيان, the opposite of العصيان, الطاعة. They would obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What? العصيان is basically disobedience. وكانوا يعتدون, the opposite of الاعتداء, التقوى. تقوى. No, العصيان is basically طاعة. The opposite of العصيان is طاعة. The opposite of الاعتداء, التقوى. They would stay within the boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put them in. ليسوا سواء. I like that when we actually, read the ayah differently. ليسوا سواء. What is ليسوا سواء? So who's ليسوا سواء? So you've got the people of the book, but then you had the beginning of that page. Should we take it out again? In the beginning of that page, what was it saying? That right there, that from Ahl al-Kitab, there are a group that are mu'mineen. So that's when it basically tells you, well, yes, from Ahl al-Kitab, there are a group that are mu'mineen. What about them? Then the ayah continues, وَلَيْسُوا سَوَاءً. Not all the people of the book are necessarily equal. So which one is not equal? Who's different from Ahl al-Kitab? He said, well, أُمَّةٌ قَائِمَةٌ. The ones that basically believed, the ones that were doing the qiyam, يَتْلُونَ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ. They would recite the words of the Lord Almighty throughout the night. And they would do sujood. So wait a minute, is this talking about Ahl al-Kitab? So is there a Christian that basically stands up all night praying and they would do sujood? Is this talking about them? No. That's why this ayah is confirming and tell you, no, don't misunderstand me here. يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. So this is people that have a history of being Ahl al-Kitab, but they're actually mu'mineen now. They're believers now. They're Muslimin now. يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. They would believe in the Lord Almighty and Judgment Day. All right? وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. And يوم الآخر, Judgment Day. وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. They would order for what is good, forbid what is evil. وَيُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ. And they would rush to do what is good. Why are they rushing to do what is good? What is the rush to do what is good? وَأُولَٰئِكَ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. And those are the people that are الصالحين. Those are the people that are salihin. So here's a question. So those are the people, they're not the same, and they're practicing a form of faith. They're practicing a form of a religious practice that is actually like the believer's practice. So how do we actually understand what they're really doing? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically here laying out that to encourage that from the mu'mineen, ummah, qa'imah, stand, yatluna ayatillah. They would recite the words of the Lord Almighty, ana al-layl, throughout the night. So what happens? This is who? This is basically al-muhsin. This is the level of al-ihsan. What's the evidence that this is the level of al-ihsan? Let's go back to Surah Al-Dhariyat. In Surah Al-Dhariyat, what was it saying? In Surah Al-Dhariyat, should we go back to Surah Al-Dhariyat?
Yes, please.
وبالأسحار هم يستغفرون وبالأسحار هم يستغفرون. Continue the ayat. Continue the ayat. Should we do it? We'll come back to it. Hold on. We're going to go back to it because this is extremely important. No, not Arkan al-Iman. This is basically going to another level. Oh, let's go back to it. We're going to see it because we need to see it so you could actually visualize it. Oh, you're going to, what was that?
We are new students. Take us there.
Take you there. I'm going to put you there.
Teachers.
Here we go. Here's Surah Al-Dhariyat. Oh, let's go to Surah Al-Dhariyat so we can actually see it. And let's see. إن المتقين في جنات وعيون آخذين ما آتاهم ربهم إنهم كانوا قبل ذلك محسنين. So hold on. What do we got? المتقين are in Jannat and in rivers. Ayun is not ayun, eyes. This is too spooky to actually think they're eyes. آخذين ما آتاهم ربهم. They'll be granted, they'll be taking and enjoying what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them. Why? إنهم كانوا قبل ذلك محسنين. Before that, they were living a level of muhsinin. This is not any kind of a believer. So what were they doing? Colon. كانوا قليلا من الليل ما يهجعون. They barely slept at night. And وبالأسحار هم يستغفرون. And throughout the night, they would spend hours just asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وفي أموالهم حق للسائل والمحروم. Well, they didn't just pay zakah. No, they exceeded the amount of what they donated for للسائل والمحروم, for the people that might have, for the people that requested a donation, and for those that were deprived. So what were they? They were muhsinin. That was the level that these people were in. So wait a minute. So these people of Ahl al-Kitab, in the ayah that we were doing, they were basically from al-Muhsinin. Yes, this is basically telling us that these people that were from Ahl al-Kitab were actually Muhsinin. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us right there that they were ummah qa'imah. They were standing, reciting the words of the Lord Almighty throughout the night, and they would do sujood. They would, now look at this word, because this word yu'minun is present. It's a constant thing. They were determined, they were committed, believing in Allah Almighty and Judgment Day. And again, look at the word ya'murun, yusari'un, yu'minun. They're all what? Present tense. Continuous. When you say continuous, what does it mean? Commitment, determined, consistency, right? So they were believing in Allah Almighty. It was constant. They were constantly ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. And they were rushing to do what is good. I was today, right before I came here, I was actually reading a story. It's munqata', but it was mentioned in Sirat Ibn Ishaq. And he was actually talking about when the Prophet ﷺ had sent Ja'far ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha and Abdullah ibn Rawaha to where? Jordan, Mu'tah. The Prophet ﷺ sent the three and he told them, if Ja'far is killed, Zayd ibn Haritha takes over. If Zayd ibn Haritha is killed, then Abdullah ibn Rawaha takes over. The Prophet ﷺ was in Medina and he was giving them live breaking news of what was happening miles and miles and miles away. Live breaking news. Ja'far is now killed. Ja'far, I could see him flying in Jannah. Live breaking news. Zayd takes the lead. Zayd is killed, and I see him in Jannah. Then the Prophet ﷺ was silent and says, Abdullah ibn Rawaha takes the lead. Later, the Prophet ﷺ is giving them the breaking news that this is what's happening. Then the Prophet ﷺ, the Ansar were sitting there and they were really afraid. So why did the Prophet ﷺ just give a short silent mode right there? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, Abdullah is killed, but he's at a level that is in Jannah next to their beds, but a little lower. So they said, the bed is lower. Why? He said, because he gave a moment of taraddud, hesitation. A moment of hesitation. A moment of hesitation led to that. In other words, the speed that you spend in rushing to do what is good, you would pray Dhuhr and the person prayed it 10 minutes after Adhan and that person prayed it after 3 hours. They're not the same. They're not the same. Yes, it was prayed on time, but it's not the same. This sister wore hijab in 2003 and that sister wore the hijab in 2008. They're not the same. They're not the same. This sister donated first when the imam said that they wanted to fix the whatever sprinklers and whatever it is. She right away rushed and said, here's my $5,000. But the other one said, here's my $5,000, but not until probably 25 minutes later. They're not the same. They're not the same. Sometimes you hold back. Well, this is to encourage us. سارعوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم. سابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم. And this is extremely important. You know what? Let me actually take you to another screen, because this is important. You know, when you look at that area, can you actually see? Do you see what I'm doing? No? Okay, that's okay. Well, take you to another screen. Okay, I'm going to take you to another screen so you could actually see a number of different things here. What? I mean, that's okay. That's okay. But at the end of the day, how fast were you in being committed? I want you to look at this. So in Musara'a fi khairat, you could see where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسَارِعُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَجَنَّةٍ عَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ سَابِقُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَجَنَّةٍ عَرْضُهَا كَعَرْضِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. So then encouraging us to even go faster. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, بادروا بالأعمال الصالحة فستكون فتن كقطع الليل المظلم يصبح الرجل مؤمنا ويمسي كافرا أو يمسي مؤمنا ويصبح كافرا يبيع دينه بعرض من الدنيا. See, this hadith is narrated by Muslim. He said, rush to doing the pious actions, for there will be fitan, there will be different trials where it would be as if it is spreading like the way the night and the dark night would be filling every single space that is around you. Where the man would wake up as a believer and then die or even get into the night as kafir. Or a person might actually be in the night a believer and in the morning they will be kafir. And they will sell their faith for crumbs of dunya, just little pieces of dunya. And when you actually look at that, when you look at the word badiru, what does that actually mean? In other words, rush to do what is right. because you may not have the time to actually do what is good. That's why there's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, look at this hadith is Hassan, narrated by Tirmidhi, and where the Prophet ﷺ said, Badiru bil a'mali sab'an, rush in 7 different things. هل تنتظرون إلا فقرا منسيا? Are you just waiting for a poverty that will just take away all your wealth? Or a wealth, in other words, richness, wealth that is going to get you off your path, مطغية. In other words, it's going to lead you into transgression, or an illness that might actually take you and basically take away your ability to decide and do something, or even an old age that will just take away all your power, or a death that might just be prepared for you, or the Dajjal is actually an evilness that is an awaited evilness that will for sure to come. Or are you waiting for the last hour? And the last hour is what is adha wa amar. It is even worse and way worse than any of these different fitan. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ is basically telling us, rush, because your poverty will probably be coming to you. Your richness will probably take away your faith. Your illness might take away your ability to decide, and you end up needing to spend it on health insurance and health coverage, or probably your old age taking away your ability to decide, or probably death coming at you, or the Dajjal any minute coming out, or are you waiting for the last hour? Now, this is extremely important to remember when we're speaking about rushing and doing what is good. You never know when that would happen. I like this hadith about Amr ibn al-Jamuh al-Ansari. Amr ibn al-Jamuh al-Ansari, he was a lame Sahabi. One of his legs had a problem, disability. So Amr ibn al-Jamuh, whenever he would need to go, he basically had his children assisting him. So then when he actually got older, and of course he's still disabled, he saw that the Prophet ﷺ was calling to the Sahaba to go for jihad. So Amr ibn al-Jamuh asked the Prophet ﷺ, he said, if I were to actually go and let me go for jihad, and he was basically right there, he said, why are you preventing me from going to Jannah? And then he comes to the Prophet ﷺ complaining about his own children, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ that the Prophet ﷺ would basically stop his children from stopping him from going to jihad. And then he said, O Prophet of Allah, if I were to be a shaheed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, would I enter with my lame leg Jannah? So the Prophet ﷺ said, as a matter of fact, you would actually enter it not lame. And that's when he basically rose his hand up to the skies and he said, O Lord Almighty, if you bring me back, then bring me back in victory. And if you take my soul, then take me as a shaheed, as a martyr. And then he leaves at that hour, that moment, wanting to be a shaheed. And the Prophet ﷺ had actually, when he heard that he had been a shaheed, the Prophet ﷺ said, Wallahi لكأني أرى عمرو بن الجموح يمضي بعرجته هذه سليما إلى الجنة. The Prophet ﷺ said, by Allah, as if I could see Amr ibn al-Jamuh actually entering Jannah with his own lame leg, but this time not lame, entering Jannah. Entering Jannah, not lame anymore. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the ayah, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُم بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةَ يُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَيَقْتُلُونَ وَيُقْتَلُونَ وعدا عليه حقا في التوراة والإنجيل والقرآن ومن أوفى بعهده من الله. So what? فَاسْتَبْشِرُوا بِبَيْعِكُمُ الَّذِي بَايَعْتُمْ بِهِ. Let me explain this ayah. That the Lord Almighty had basically given a trade-off for the believers, that they would invest their wealth and even their life for Jannah. Well, they would fight for the sake of the Lord Almighty. They would kill and even get killed. And this is a promise that the Lord Almighty had actually mentioned in the Quran, in the Torah, and even in the Injil and in the Quran. And there's no one to be committed to their promise more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, then be prepared and be prepared. In other words, fastabshiru, be enlightened. And with the trade-off that you had put in, the investment that you had put in, and that is the true victory. Because at the end of the day, and we're just to keep that in mind when we're speaking about sari'u and going fast in being putting in the investment for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically taking in that moment to recognize وَأُولَٰئِكَ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ, and those are the people that are from الصالحين. وَمَا يَفْعَلُ مِنْ خَيْرٍ فَلَا يُكْفَرُ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ بِالْمُتَّقِينَ. And whatever good that they would do, whatever good, فَلَا يُكْفَرُ, the Lord Almighty would not disregard it. And the Lord Almighty is all-knowing with those that are muttaqeen. So are they muttaqeen or are they muhsineen? They're actually both. They're actually both. You know what? How about we do just a, if anybody has any questions. No questions? Should I stop right here? Oh, you're still thinking? No questions? Should we stop right here? You want me to continue? Raise your voice, Bishara. I can barely hear you.
You know, kids will try to
Wallah, Bishara, I can barely hear you, my dear. I can barely hear you. Get closer, get closer.
Okay, so when we stop helping our kids, like,
Come and sit in my chair. Yeah.
when do you stop helping them? Like when you show them, like, okay, now
When do you stop helping your kids, you're asking?
I mean, not,
So
like,
you
not literally withdraw, but just says, okay, whatever.
you never stop helping your kids, just like you would never stop helping even anyone. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells us, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. That commitment, that support for one another to do what is good and to support one another in helping them see the truth and helping them live the truth, it never stops. I'll always be there for my son. I'll always be the mom, even if he's 6'5". I'll get up on a chair and slap him on the chair.
Oh, you're still an enforcer until.
What?
So the question I think is more on when do you become a consultant?
No, I'm basically
Am I
saying,
an enforcer until they die, or am I an enforcer then I have to get a consultant?
so basically I'm saying that you're going to be supporting your child to be committed to recognize al-haq and committed to applying haq in their life. So you would never stop. But here's one thing, is that Ali ibn Abi Talib did mention, all right, did mention that, be a friend to them for 7 and be their mentor for 7 and be their friend for 7. Okay. Although this is Ali ibn Abi Talib, just giving you some tips on parenting. So you're basically going to direct them at 7. And then when they're between the ages of, let's say, 7 and 11, you're basically giving them mentorship, you're talking to them, you're basically giving them a stronger or a different kind of a mentorship. And then when they're 11, between 11 and, so we're looking at 18, they're basically getting a different form of mentorship from you, and where you're being a companion to them. You're trying to go to their level and try to bring them their understanding, to bring it in a clear, different way. All right. It's totally different than when they were younger. All right. So we're looking at that age group. All right. And then after that, you're basically trying to use the different times in where they might need a good advice. They might need a moment where you would bring it to their attention. You might need to more give them directions, because you want to keep in mind in where they will not necessarily be mature entirely until they're at age 40. The true maturity is at age 40. حتى إذا بلغ أشده وبلغ 40 سنة. When they reach, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, when they reach the age of maturity and they reach the age of 40. So the age of 40 is really their age of maturity. And what happened? You're doubting that age 40?
Some people are still mature after 40.
Absolutely. You know, the people that are still not mature after 40, كبر عليهم أربعة, I guess. So I don't know what to tell you. Yeah. Maturity, I love that. Maturity is different than puberty. Pay attention to this one, Bisharu. Maturity is different than puberty, because puberty in girls is different than puberty in boys. Puberty is body development. When the body basically is developing certain basically, let's call it changes, in where it's showing signs that this person is capable of reproducing one of its kind. That's a body development. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَدْفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the aitam, about the orphans, that when there is a guardian for them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم. When you sense that they had reached the age of rushda. Wait a minute, what is a rushd? Let's actually take you into Surat al-Hujurat. Because in order for me to understand the rushd, I basically have to go to that in order to understand where I'm at. So I won't be making up my own definition of different things. We need to understand what is a rushd. Look at this one. Pay attention to this one. Surah Al-Hujurat is before it. Pay attention to it. This is interesting, very, very interesting. Let's look at this ayah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, look at this ayah. And the quote here, وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانِ وَزَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ وَكَرَّهَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكُفْرَ وَالْفُسُوقَ وَالْعِصْيَانَ أُولَئِكَ هُمُ الرَّاشِدُونَ. Who's a Rashid? Who's really the mature person? In order to be a mature person, number one, you have to love faith. You have to recognize where your definition of recognizing right and wrong are. If you don't have that place, if you don't have the lens to recognize right and wrong, we're sorry, but you're still not mature to recognize yet. Number two, زَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ. You had recognized at that level. It was beautified in your heart that you only love faith. You only love principle. Not only that, it's not enough to love good, but you also have to hate disbelief. Al-fusuq. What is al-fusuq? Major and minor sin, and even the smallest sin. Those are the true Rashidun. So what does that mean in terms of action? In terms of action, the ayah says, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا. This is okay at the level of faith, but what is the level of the technical level, the practical level? How do I actually sense that? آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا. Are they mature in recognizing their deen? Are they mature in recognizing their body, or do they still need somebody to help them recognize what it means to be clean, what it means to brush their teeth, what it means to do self-hygiene, what it means to maintain their room clean, what it means to maintain and even clean up after they eat. This is their nafs. Number 3, do they still need somebody to remind them about doing their homework? Are they understanding what it means to stay away from different intoxicants and drugs and all these different things, that these things are harmful? Do they understand that level? Number 4, do they understand and recognize how to maintain their modesty? Do they recognize how to maintain the distances? As a boy, don't get around women. As a woman, don't get around men. Do they recognize the distances? They recognize the adab? Do they recognize family and social skills? And do they recognize the responsibilities and rights towards the people around them, the rights towards their brothers, the rights towards their parents? Do they recognize these things? Money, that's the last thing. Money, do they recognize what it means to do money management? Or is he basically just wanting to spend his money on gaming, or spend his money on shoes that are name brands and clothes that are name brands, when they're still behind on their rent, still behind on the utilities? Well, if they're still behind on their utilities and they can't even recognize, they still want mama to spend on them, you've got a problem. This person is not mature. If they're still wanting mama to spend on them, if they still want mama to be the one to pay for their food and pay for their clothing and pay for their gas and pay for their car insurance, this is an immature person. This is an immature person. This is a baby. They don't have the right to hold money. You know why they don't have the right to hold money? Because they still need these people. They're basically considered as the ones that are wandering the money in, where there's something called al-hajr. What is al-hajr? They're supposed to be quarantined from using their money. Yes, this is real. They're supposed to be quarantined Islamically from using their money because they don't know how to use it.
Is money management like
When they don't know how to do money management, when these people are doing and living that, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَادْفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم. That's when you want to give them the money. But when they're actually still living as immature, that you can't give them their money. Well, it's not just money, but you can't even give them the right to decision making on many things. They still need a wali. They still need a wali, even if it's a man, absolutely, even if it's a man. If this man is still not acting responsible, he also needs a wali. This is real. This is real. He also needs a wali. If they didn't even reach a rushd. Okay.
Is there a way, like, for example, somebody was rich, and when you pass away, alhamdulillah, you to that there. But then the wealth becomes inheritance. So a wealth that is inheritance and the kids need to be born by. Does that come in, or I'm free and I went to Allah and they need to figure out?
Well, what we have to do, Zamzam, is that we have to work towards making our children be Rashidin in their religion and even in their life. But if you're still picking up after your kids, their laundry, when they are supposed to be by age 11, according to the rule that Ali ibn Abi Talib had put, you're in trouble. Ali ibn Abi Talib told you, mentor them at 7. I'll tell you to pick up the laundry, but by age 13, you should know. Laundry needs to be picked up. I expect that you would know that it needs to go to the laundry room. I expect you know how to put it inside that washing machine. I expect that you know that you have to turn off the lights. I expect that you know that if you've got homework, you got to work on it. I don't have to be there watching your homework, but if I'm going to be there still making sure that you're doing your homework, then you're nothing but a child. Sorry, you cannot get married yet. You can't get married, and you certainly cannot even have your money. And you certainly should not be getting a phone. And you certainly should not be left alone. Simple as that. Quarantined. This is real. You should be quarantined. Not until you show maturity and you show what it means to be responsible are you given the privileges of independence. But to ask for independence when you're not even maintaining your personal matters, independence of what? When you still need mama to do your matters for you, independence on what? You won't survive without mama being next to you. You can't be independent.
Sometimes it's not, I mean, they know that you're gonna, whatever mom has behind is there, so we start using it now.
Well, that's why you need to teach them from young age.
Make them
What? You know what one of the reasons why, by the way, this mental illness, sometimes it's becoming an industry more than anything else. This is real. What's actually happening is that the challenges when the person had not been taught to recognize that they have to face the challenge and deal with the challenge. And instead of looking at the challenge that I have to deal with it and fix it, but they would actually go into a trauma. It's basically because they didn't have the experience in dealing with the challenge. So they would start seeing the challenge as a trauma. They would then go into what is called the mental illness. That's a thing.
Yes.
But if every single challenge they're expecting mama to be there to help them fix it, then when they go into the real challenge, they're basically going to get into a mental illness. Why? Because they didn't learn how to cope in fixing and going around the challenge and getting to the bottom of the challenge. My shoes are lost. Mom is supposed to come to the rescue. Put on her cape and look for the shoes. Simple. Search for them. Not mama coming to the rescue, giving you those shoes. Go and search. Do your math. Where did I last leave them? Where did I put them? Might somebody have probably cleaned up and put them in prospected areas? Let them learn how to do it. What did I do? But if every challenge you're going to come to the rescue to save them for it, that's when they get older, even though it's a simple challenge, but they'll see it as a trauma. And then they're going to need therapy. And then guess what? They'll be diagnosed with depression, trauma. And then guess what's going to happen? And these therapists will be like, did you ever? Were you feeling not safe at home? Yeah, my mom actually spanked me because I didn't wash the dishes. All right, here we go. This person is basically facing child abuse. That's exactly what's happening right now. Therapists right now is like, oh, this person went through child abuse. It wasn't child abuse. If making the child learn how to face challenges is called child abuse, well, this is actually putting them in their own abuse. This is putting them in trauma. But then did your mom ever talk to you in a loud voice or etc.? Well, you better believe my mom was talking to me that way. And you better believe my dad talked to me that way. Did you think that any police officer is carrying cookies and Gucci bags to encourage you to do what is good? They carry guns. They carry pepper spray. They carry handcuffs. Like, definitely don't say, come out and with your hands up because we need to have a conversation right now.
They say,
That's not what a police officer would do, my dear. This is the real world. They would yell out, come up with your hands up. You have the right to remain silent. In other words, shut up. That's exactly what they will tell you. In other words, shut up. It's simple as that. This is the real world. If you don't actually discipline them at home,
sister, I
you will then let them face nothing but the cruelty in prison. Simple as that. But the cruelty in prison, but the cruelty in the gangs and these people. The only reason why you would tell your child you need to do these chores, it's not because you hate them, it's because you want to make sure that's the ABCs of parenthood. You need to make sure that she is equipped or he is equipped with the coping skills to help them see the challenges as a game to overcome, not as a trauma to succumb to. That's the main thing that we have to do. Time for a cookie. After that, I think Azadine is feeling like, let me cool. After mom's words, let me just try to maintain my. I think he was feeling targeted. So he's like, I'll just get a cookie. It'll probably help me heal.
George Floyd, they were-
George Floyd,
yeah, he called his mom.
he called his mom? Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's subhanAllah. I mean, even when you actually see, you go to prisons and stuff, the first person that when you go to prisons, the first people that they would actually call is really their mom. Their mom. And this person would be this huge 6'5" muscular guy with muscles like this, but he's like, Mama. And you'd be like, wait a minute, what's going on? I mean, you guys, you go to prisons and these guys are huge. I mean, they're like, I don't know, but they're huge. Some guys are like 6'5" and they're, muscular, and it looks like they've been working out 5-6 hours. I have no idea how long they've been working out for. And you'd be like, it's okay. You'd be like, and then he'd still be called Mama. And it's like, Mama, Mama. It just feels like, it's like, you really, you have to think about it. It's like, Mama, this guy is 6'5" and calling out on Mama.
This guy who works at the store, my son,
The guy that works at the store.
my son, and he was like, is this your mom? Things like that. And I haven't think of that. It was like, you say his mom was single mom, and he was good, she worked 3 jobs.
Right.
You say, I see the oldest, like 25 now. Back. So and he started crying. So I wish my mom came home and I washed the dishes. So much.
Well, that's one thing I would say, one of the main reasons to why we're actually getting this mental health issue, this mental health crisis, is really one of the main reasons is really because it's really bad parenting, where we would think that we are just supposed to be making life easy for them, that it's our responsibility to make life easy for them rather than them contributing to make their life easy for themselves. The word teenager is one of the most dangerous words, because right now it's becoming this word to mean that it's okay, they're just going through a phase. In Islam, no. They're adults. Treat them that way, and they have to recognize that they're held responsible and accountable for their actions. Sorry about that, everyone. I know
Is the word maskana and masakin with the same root? Yes, the root is sakana. Sakana to mean, no, sakana to mean to dwell. Calm. بس يا ماما بس روح غادر روح غادر. All right, so this is it. And if anybody wants to ask something online as well, so we could see, oh, no one's actually wanting to say anything. Oh no, what did I just do? Whoops. I just disconnected everything by mistake. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Very good, alhamdulillah. How are you doing? Good to see